Hey everyone, I wanted to make a video reading Refuse Fascism's new call to action and but first their past two calls to action and then their new one for a little compare and contrast, and also just discussing and going over them. So what is Refuse Fascism? It is a group a group and a movement dedicated to driving out the Trump-Pence regime from power. And the call to action itself will, self-describe the group in a better way than I'm doing right now. So let's get into it. No, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. Drive out the Trump-Pence regime. The Trump-Pence regime is a fascist regime, not insult or exaggeration. This is what it is. For the future of humanity and the planet, we, the people, must drive this regime out. Donald Trump and Mike Pence have assembled a vicious cabal that has put forth positions and begun initiatives which demonstrate that they fully intend to shred political and social norms with catastrophic consequence. Because Trump has his finger on the nuclear trigger, the Trump-Pence regime is more dangerous to the world than even Hitler. Potentially, could be put in parentheses. Not as dangerous yet, but potentially. Fascism has direction and momentum. Dissent is piece by piece criminalized. The truth is bludgeoned. Group after group is demonized and targeted along a trajectory that leads to real horrors. All of this has already begun under the Trump regime. History has shown that fascism must be stopped before it becomes too late. Millions of people outraged by this regime took to the streets, delivering a stinging rebuke to Trump the day after the inauguration. Protest and resistance continues against the many attacks on the people by the Trump-Pence administration. This must grow broader, deeper, and more determined. This resistance is righteous and necessary, but it is not sufficient. We must recognize that the character of fascism is such that it can absorb separate acts of resistance while continually throwing the opposition off balance by rapidly moving its agenda forward. The Trump-Pence regime will repeatedly launch new, highly repressive measures, eventually clamping down on all resistance and remaking the law if they are not driven from power. In the first weeks of the Trump-Pence regime, they have begun subverting the separation of powers, the separation of church and state, called for a new nuclear arms race, demonized the press, dismissed the very concept of truth, substituting their own fabricated, quote, alternative facts. It can already be said of the Trump-Pence regime that first they came for the Muslims, then the Mexicans, then all refugees, then women, then Black and Latino people, LGBTQ persons, the environment, and anyone who doesn't conform or submit to their vision and plan for a nation cohered around white supremacy and a political form of Christian fundamentalism that should rightly be called Christian fascism. Fascism is not just a gross combination of horrific reactionary policies. It is a qualitative change in how society is governed. Fascism foments and relies on xenophobic nationalism, racism, misogyny, and the aggressive reinstitution of oppressive, quote, traditional values. In Trump's election campaign, he encouraged and fed on the threat and use of violence to build a movement and come to power. In his inaugural address, he pledged allegiance only to his movement. What is crucial to understand is that once in power, fascism essentially eliminates traditional democratic rights. Even as the Trump-Pence regime is moving fast, they have not yet fully consolidated their regime, or, as yet, been able to fully implement their program. But this is their objective, and it is very possible. It might only take a single serious crisis, international or domestic, for this regime to drop the hammer. We do not have much time. Don't normalize. Don't accommodate. Don't conciliate. Don't collaborate. There is method to Trump's madness that echoes Hitler. Fascism advances in stages through outrage, shock, and intimidation, followed by brief periods of normalization where people accommodate to the new situation the regime has imposed. After the election, Obama said of Trump, quote, we are now all rooting for his success, end quote. No, if Trump succeeds, humanity loses. Bernie Sanders has said that he will work with Trump on jobs or where they agree. No, if you work with fascists, you normalize the road to horror. This is not just a pendulum swing Democrat to Republican, but a regime that is moving to establish a fascist order under the signboard of, quote, America First. Acting as if the election in 2018 or 2020 is the way to deal with this regime is folly, betraying a total lack of understanding of just how fast, furious, and profoundly this regime will change the rules, cement its rule, destroy lives, and crush spirits. You cannot try to wait things out. Those who lived through Nazi Germany and sat on the sidelines, looking on as Hitler demonized, criminalized, and eventually rounded up one group after another, became shameful collaborators with monstrous crimes. All of this is what renders the Trump-Pence regime illegitimate and a grave threat to people all over the world. Therefore, we resolve these 4 things. 1. Our single unifying mission must be to drive out the Trump-Pence regime. Number 2, we must manifest the power of no everywhere, on signs, billboards, walls, social media, and the news. No, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America must resound. Every outrage committed by this regime must be met with greater and greater resistance. We must organize. Number 3 was every outrage committed by this regime must be met with greater and greater resistance. Number 4, we must organize, working with all our creativity and determination toward the time when millions of people can be moved to fill the streets of cities and towns day after day and night after night, declaring this whole regime illegitimate, demanding and not stopping until the Trump-Pence regime is driven from power. That last one, number 4, is basically a synopsis of what this group is about in a nutshell. That is the bottom line of what they're about. Now, if this happens, then the whole political landscape would be dramatically transformed. Every faction within the established power structure would be forced to respond, and all of this could lead to a situation in which this fascist regime is driven from office. Let it not be said that we did not move heaven and earth to drive out this regime. This must be a moment in history when millions of people stand together with conviction and courage, overcoming fear and uncertainty, to resist and say no, not just for ourselves, but in the name of humanity. Drive out the Trump-Pence regime. RefuseFascism.org. They have their phone number here, 917-407-1286. And their email, info@refusefascism.org. Their Twitter and Instagram handle, @refusefascism. I'm going to put all this information in the description box, so yeah. Anyway, here is the second call to action that led up to November 4th, which was an effort. November 4th begins was the slogan. But it was an effort to actually make that number 4th. We organize, we get millions of people out in the streets to get it started in a really serious way. It failed to reach a critical mass that would enable that, but it was a good, serious effort good try. And 4,000 people across the country. Oh, I'm so sorry. Stupid message popped up. Okay, back to this. But yeah, November 4th, 4,000 people came out across the country to attempt that. They were not attempting a revolution or some armed revolt or whatever, like right-wing trolls were talking about, but attempting something very serious and very necessary, just non-violently. And I feel like getting violent with my phone. Okay, I'm back. So the second call to action, let's get into it. Join the movement that is protesting day after day and night after night and not stopping until our demand is met. This nightmare must end. The Trump-Pence regime must go. A nightmare. Immigrants living in terror. Their next step could mean detention, deportation, being torn from children and loved ones. A nightmare. Muslims and refugees demonized, banned, and cast out. A nightmare. Millions, children, the elderly, the sick, the poor, denied health care, food assistance, and the very right to live. A nightmare. Women objectified, degraded, and denied the basic right to control their own reproduction, with fundamentalist Christian fascism increasingly being made law. A nightmare. LGBTQ people stigmatized, ostracized, and denied civil rights recently won. A nightmare. Black and Latino people openly threatened by the president with maximum sentencing. Stop and frisk going national, intensified police brutality, and murder of our youth with no holds barred. A nightmare. People all over the world facing bombs, occupations, war, and the threat of nuclear war, with Donald Trump's America First finger on the nuclear trigger. A nightmare. The truth bludgeoned. Lies and more lies. Critical thinking being destroyed in education and public discourse. A nightmare. The whole planet in peril from a regime that denies global warming and shreds all environmental protections. A nightmare. A regime step-by-step discarding basic democratic rights, targeting group after group, and suppressing dissent and resistance. A regime unleashing the violence of white supremacist anti-Semites and fascist thugs. This is fascism, a qualitative change in how society is governed. History has shown that fascism must be stopped before it becomes too late. This nightmare must end. Millions feel this and ache with the question of how to stop this unrelenting horror. The stakes are nothing less than the future of humanity and the planet itself. Who will end this nightmare? We will. Only the determined struggle of millions of people acting together with courage and conviction can drive this regime from power. Join us. Take to the streets and public squares across the country, beginning a movement of protests that continue day after day and night after night. A movement working to grow from thousands to hundreds of thousands and eventually millions. A movement determined to not stop until our demand is met. This nightmare must end. The Trump-Pence regime must go. Our actions will reflect the values of respect for all of humanity and the world we want, in stark contrast to the hate and bigotry of the Trump-Pence fascist regime. Our determination to persist and not back down will compel the whole world to take note. Every force and faction in the power structure would be forced to respond to our demand. The cracks and divisions among the powers evident today will sharpen and widen. As we draw more and more people forward to stand up, all of this could lead to a situation where this illegitimate regime is removed from power. Spread the word and organize. Be a part of making history. Don't let it be said that you stood aside when there was a chance to stop a regime that imperils humanity and the earth itself. Join us in taking to the streets and the public squares day after day and night after night. Let's stand together with courage and conviction, overcoming fear and uncertainty, demonstrating that, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. This nightmare must end. The Trump-Pence regime must go. RefuseFascism.org. In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. Okay. RefuseFascism.org is a movement of people coming from diverse perspectives, united in our recognition that the Trump-Pence regime poses a catastrophic danger to humanity and the planet, and that is our responsibility to drive them from power through nonviolent protest. So again, another good descriptor of who they are, what they're about. And I totally believe in them, totally agree with that premise, and applaud them. But I do have my problems with Refuse Fascism, and I'm going to get into that as the video rolls on. But let's go to the third and most recent version of the call to action. This nightmare must end. The Trump-Pence regime must go. In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. We are horrified and angered at the shocking damage already done to lives here and around the world by the Trump-Pence regime. We recognize that they are poised to do far worse, including threatening war, even nuclear war. Through an unrelenting barrage of daily outrages and Twitter outbursts, the Trump-Pence regime is radically remaking society, step by step hammering into place a vicious American fascism. This is not insult or exaggeration. It is what they are doing. Therefore, we resolve that nothing short of removing this whole illegitimate regime from power will stop this nightmare. There is a way to do this. To do so, we must cast aside illusions and self-delusions. All too many people think and act as if what we face is just the worst of pendulum swings between Republicans and Democrats. No, this regime, if left in power, will effect a thoroughly reactionary restructuring of society. If we think that the normal processes of 2018 or 2020 elections or the Mueller investigation will, by themselves, redress the situation that humanity faces, we are not understanding the determination of these fascists in power to shatter norms, even though they have been doing so for over a year. If we think that the heightened activism of the past year, either by itself or taken together with the elections, will stop this regime, we are missing the picture of how much harm this regime has already done, absorbing individual protests as it rapidly moves its agenda forward on multiple fronts. If we are not as outraged and motivated to act today as we were right after the election, we are on our way to accepting or ignoring a great horror that builds daily. If we adjust to the injustice of this regime and do not, if we adjust to the injustice of this regime, what it should have is then do not ask. But if we adjust to the injustice of this regime, then do not ask how the German people could have accepted Nazism in the 1930s. And American fascism. We must not reassure ourselves that it could not happen here. It is. Trump's Make America Great Again is a 21st century fascist program of manifest destiny. Quote, America First, wrapped in the flag, and Mike Pence's Bible taken literally, with a program of white supremacist white supremacy, misogyny, and xenophobia. Um, and just a note on that, like the American First rhetoric and just the phrase America First, um, it has its roots in anti-Semitism completely. Back in the 1930s and the 1940s, when Jews were fleeing Germany and, well, much of Europe, that was, being steadily bombarded and taken over by Germany, Nazi Germany. The United States had like an immigration policy that made it hard for Jewish refugees to enter, made it pretty close to impossible up to the tail end of the war when things started to open up for them more. And we realized that, oh my God, a fucking Holocaust is happening. Let's help them out. Like, for fuck's sake, But during that time, there were a lot of reactionary people, just like how there are reactionary folks that are responding to Muslims and, just Middle Eastern refugees in general very negatively. There was a whole lot of Semitism, anti-Semitism, and a whole lot of people that were reacting to Jewish refugees in a very similar way. And America First was a phrase thrown around back then to, prop up this anti-Jew immigration policy and actually embolden things on the part of racists and, anti-Semites. So yeah, just a note on that. That phrase has a root directly to anti-Semitism, at a time when Nazism was disgustingly on the march and taking over in Europe. So to say that this regime is not fascist is total delusion. Okay, back to the call to action. This regime denies truth and objective evidence, and yet it has its hands on the most powerful military and nuclear arsenal in history and is preparing and threatening to use it. Millions of people, or millions of immigrants living in terror, fearing their loved ones will be ripped away. People's humanity is viciously denied. Women are poised to lose the right to abortion. Trump and Sessions have instructed police to take the gloves off, further brutalizing people of color. LGBTQ rights recently won are now under assault. Damage done to the environment by this regime is just 14 months, or in just 14 months, could be irreversible. That's arguable. Like, damage done to the environment by this regime in just 14 months could be irreversible. That part's debatable. Sorry, just had to pause the video real briefly. Okay, so back to this part. Damage done to the environment by this regime in just 14 months could be irreversible. Now that seems like a really big exaggeration. Like, this regime has done some very unfortunate things to the environment, and the changes that have been made to policies and the harm done to the environment itself, yeah, it's worse than the Obama administration, for example, but it's the same old capitalist imperialist system that is destroying the environment and unleashing climate change. That hasn't essentially changed, and it's not as if there's been some total upheaval and escalation that's made damage done to the environment irreversible. Now, changes made to the EPA itself, well, that's a subject for debate. Maybe that's irreversible, but not really. like that can be undone, especially if have like a new president steps in that is really progressive on environmental issues. But also the point they're trying to make is that democratic elections and the rule of law could be totally compromised or eliminated entirely. So, okay, that might not happen then, and it could be irreversible. But that's also hypothetical. What is really a subject for debate is whether climate change is irreversible or not at this point in time. I would argue that it is, but we're reaching very dangerous territory. That could be a turning point that would be very hard to reverse. But the role that the Trump-Pence administration has played in making that worse, it's like a tiny, tiny sliver over all of the carbon emissions of all of humanity for the past couple hundred years or past thousands of years. Yeah. Okay, so let's get back into the call to action. It picks back up. Fascism rules by organized repression and terror by the government. Civil liberties are stripped away, law rewritten, dissent criminalized, the courts packed with fascists, and the separation of powers and church and state ultimately eviscerated. As part of radically remaking society, the Trump-Pence regime must sharply attack those in positions of power who oppose them. Fascism mobilizes mobs of vicious thugs, as we've seen with Nazis marching and murdering in Charlottesville, Virginia. The Trump-Pence regime has not yet been able to implement their full program, but they are advancing. It might only take a serious single crisis, international or domestic, for this regime to drop the hammer. Don't normalize, don't accommodate, don't conciliate, don't collaborate. People all over the world are counting on us to stop this nightmare. The different strains of fascist demagogues and movements in this country see in Trump and Pence their, quote, last chance to achieve their reactionary program. They will not listen to facts or reason. They have already and will continue to change rules, manipulate elections, and they will not give up. The Democratic Party leadership will not lead us out of this. They are about maintaining order for their whole setup. For them, order is more important than justice, even if that means the order of fascism. After Trump's election, President Obama said of Trump, quote, "We are all on the same team. We are now all rooting for his success," end quote. No. If Trump succeeds, it will be catastrophic. Sorry, I did have to go outside for the rest of this because my parents just got home, and it would have been a lot of noise and disruption and distraction. It would have made it hard to record the video. So I'm going to launch back into where I was at in this call to action. Okay, after Trump's election, President Obama said of Trump, quote, "We are all on the same team. We are all now rooting for his success," end quote. No, if Trump succeeds, it will be catastrophic. But there is another way, a different kind of protest. We need to organize now for the time when we can launch massive, sustained, nonviolent protests in the streets of cities and towns across the country. Protests that continue day after day and don't stop. Creating the kind of political situation in which the demand that the Trump-Pence regime must be removed. Creating this demand that the Trump-Pence regime must be removed from power is met. Everyone who recognizes the Trump-Pence nightmare is a nightmare and must end is invited to join in and prepare for launching this great act of sustained resistance. Imagine tens of thousands beginning in several cities and towns with marches, candlelight vigils, rallies, students, religious communities, immigrants, everyone with a heart for humanity in the streets and not backing down, growing from thousands to hundreds of thousands and eventually to millions. Our actions will reflect the values of respect for all of humanity and the world we want, in stark contrast to the hate and bigotry of the Trump-Pence fascist regime. The whole world will have to take heart and take note. Okay, just a second. Okay. This will shake millions of people awake, with many losing their adjustment to life under this regime. The international credibility of the regime will be undermined. A determined struggle that doesn't yield and won't be provoked can create a serious political crisis. Those in power who are themselves now under attack by the regime but conciliating with it would be compelled to respond to our struggle from below, leading to a situation where this whole illegitimate regime is removed from power. This would be hard, but possible. No one said it would be easy. Possible because millions of people feel the horror of the Trump-Pence regime. Many have righteously protested different outrages, but we must rise to another level of determined resistance. We must confront the reality that the world as we have known it is being torn asunder. This requires getting out of our comfort zones and not allowing our differences to stand in the way of rising together in an unprecedented, unrelenting mass struggle to confront the danger of a Trump-Pence fascist America. We pledge that we will not stand aside while there is still a chance to stop a regime that imperils humanity and the earth itself. Join us. Let's stand together with courage and conviction, overcoming fear and uncertainty, to struggle with all we've got to demand. The Trump-Pence regime must go. In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept the fascist America. This nightmare must end. The Trump-Pence regime must go. So, that's it. That is the third and final call to action. So, now I want to get into Refuse Fascism, where I disagree with them. Largely, I agree with them and agree with the total premise of what they're out to accomplish, getting tens of millions of people in the streets day after day, night after night, in the name of humanity,